Thank you. Good evening to everyone and a warm welcome to this evening's session. I'm Professor Jeanette Moritz and I will be guiding you through our 2 hours this evening, and we will be spending time looking at your chapter development in a master's dissertation. So you will also have the opportunity after the presentation, if you have any questions, to put them in the question and answer this section, and then we can have a look at them after the slides. So from my side, again, a warm welcome. There might be some doctoral students present as well. For those students, there's a lot of overlap between tonight's session, but there is a special session for you tomorrow evening as well. But for tonight, we are going to focus on a master's dissertation. Just as a way to just make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to start off with just clarifying some terms, and then we'll dig into what your master's dissertation looks like as it develops. So for now, I'm going to unshare my video, and then I will just be chatting to you. Have a good time with me. All right, so when we talk about a master's dissertation, I just wanted to clarify for us what is the difference between a thesis and a dissertation. In a master's study, we speak about a dissertation. A thesis we speak about in a doctoral study, but for a master's study, we refer to a dissertation. So it's a master's dissertation or a doctoral thesis. Now, the difference between the two, you can imagine the thesis is much broader. There's a wider scope and also more expectations around it. But for a master's dissertation, the standard length is usually around about 100 pages or about 50,000 words. So where a doctoral thesis can be anything from 350 to 500 words. So already you can understand that the master's dissertation the scope is more limited. In a master's dissertation, the outcome that you need to achieve is to demonstrate to the examiner, firstly, that you are able to follow the research process. Now, we'll get back to that very important aspect. Are you able to demonstrate that you can follow the research process? And one way of demonstrating that is how you present your master's dissertation, because there's a logical flow and the presentation also follows the research process. But we'll talk about that a bit later. Also, just in terms of clarifying, I often have questions in terms of what is the difference between a title versus a topic. Now, your title summarizes the main idea or ideas in your study, and a good title contains the fewest possible words that adequately describe the contents and or the purpose of your research. Usually, we do not want titles that's longer than 15 words, and the reason for that has to do with the indexing of your titles. And so please try and refrain from very lengthy titles. Often the students would put the context in the title, which also makes it very lengthy. For instance, in South Africa or in Lesotho or in Gauteng, those could be omitted because you will speak about the context in your main text. So if you have a current working title, then see how it stands. Does it describe what it needs to describe succinctly? And see if you can work within those word limits. Now, a topic is much wider. The topic is your research interest or the phenomena that you want to study. So your topic is wide and your title summarizes your main idea of the study and not the entire phenomena under your topic. So I hope this helps just to clarify, and I'm just trying to preempt some of the questions that I often have coming up in these presentations. All right, so if you get this, the structure and layout of a dissertation reflects the flow of the overall research process, as I said in the beginning. Now let's have a look at the research process. Now the research process is quite general and follows more or less the same path in most disciplines. So mostly the research process would begin when there's a research idea. So your research idea might be your topic. The next, so you can imagine that when we talk about a research idea, your first chapter might be telling your reader, which is the examiner, what your research idea is. So chapter 1 generally is an overview of your study. Then your chapter 2 is usually your literature review and the theoretical formulation of your research problem. You can also have in your chapter 2 and maybe then chapter 3 discuss your theoretical frameworks or departures from those. So these might be in one chapter or it could be into separate chapters. Then you formulate your research questions. How are you going to, what is it that you want to know about the problem or the topic under investigation? And then you will come usually to your chapter, if your literature review is one chapter, then your chapter 3 would be your research design, your planning, how you're going to collect data, and how are you going to analyze your data. The following chapter would then be the presentation of your results. And the comparison with earlier research is when you now deal with your discussion, which might be part of your results or findings chapter, or it might be a separate chapter. And then we come to the last chapter in which we discuss the conclusions. So this is just a visual to just have you visualize what the research process looks like and why your chapters in your dissertation follows the route that it does. So the research process has a logical path that it follows and progresses. And in the same way, your chapters for your dissertation would then follow the research process, and you would report them on this research process in your chapters as they follow. So the structure of your dissertation could depend on your field, but it's usually divided in at least 4 or 5 chapters, which includes an introduction and a conclusion chapter for a dissertation. Now, there's one caveat in that, is that it can depend on your study field. So there might be slight variances. For instance, if you're in literature studies, it might look a bit different how you present your dissertation. But for most of the fields, this is quite a generic way of presenting your dissertation. If you're unsure and if you don't know where to begin, also I hope you'll have more clarity after tonight's presentation, but also consult your supervisor, your departmental guidelines or the university guidelines. Those can also help. It's always a good idea to maybe go to the library or ask the librarian to see some dissertations in your department or your field that's already successfully completed. And that might also give you an idea as to how to present your chapters. So in terms of just putting it all together before we discuss each chapter separately, the generic structure would then, as we talked through the research process, have the following outline. So your chapter 1 is an introduction to your topic. So you are introducing your idea, your topic, and a tentative template for what the reader can expect in the rest of your dissertation. So it's not only an introduction to your topic, but it's also an introduction to your study. And we're going to go in detail for each of these chapters, but this is just to get a holistic idea. As I said, chapter 2, usually your literature review that surveys relevant sources. You might have a separate chapter on your theoretical frameworks, or it might be included in chapter 2. So chapter 3 is an explanation of your methodology. So your methodology refers to your design and methods. So that tells the reader how are you going to go about answering your research questions and fulfilling the objectives and purpose of your study as you explained it in chapter 1. So chapter 1 might give an overview of the study, and chapter 3 will then go into greater depth in terms of how you're going to do it. Once you've collected and analyzed your data, the following chapter, usually around chapter 4, you will provide the results, or in qualitative study, the findings of your research. Chapter 5 is usually a discussion of the results and their implication. And sometimes you can have your discussion in chapter 4 as well and integrate it with your findings, or otherwise it can be a chapter on its own. And then finally, the last chapter is a conclusion that shows what your research has contributed and what, so I usually look at chapter 1 first, and then I go to the last chapter, and I look if what you promised in chapter 1, if that promise was delivered, and I will usually then check chapter 7 or 6 or 7, whatever the last chapter is, to see if you actually fulfilled the aims and objectives that you wanted to in your study. So that's more or less a generic outline that you'll find in most dissertations. So let us now take a bit of time and go into a little more depth in terms of what you can expect or what is expected in each chapter. So chapter 1 presents the core of your research. So the main aim of this chapter is to orientate the reader or orientate your examiner what they can expect in your study. So students often find it quite strange that I say you write for the examiner, but the examiner is the one person or people that's going to evaluate your dissertation. So the supervisor definitely reads along the way and guides you, but you are actually writing for the examiner. You must also remember that probably after that reading by the examiner, very few people will actually go back and read your dissertation, but you will probably communicate your findings in a journal article. But for the purpose of the dissertation, you need to orientate your reader, and you do that in chapter 1. So as all your chapters will have an introduction, but chapter 1 has an introduction to the chapter, but also introduces your study. So in chapter 1, you'll usually find the background of the problem statement. So what's the problem? For who is it a problem? Where is it a problem? How is it a problem? And what will happen if you don't attend to this problem? And then you would have your purpose of your study, your research questions, and you, along with this, also your research objectives. Now, when we come to chapter 1 and you discuss your research design and methods, it is an overview only. You really just nod and tell the reader what they can expect, because you're going to discuss your design and methods at length in your chapter 3 or 4, your methodological chapter. So we don't want to repeat information, and therefore it's really just a short description of what you intend to do in your chapter 1. Your chapter 1 may include your ethical considerations. So you could, for instance, say in chapter 1 that you received ethical clearance, and these are the ethical principles that the study adheres to. Or you might move it to your chapter 3 or 4, where you discuss your design and methods in length. This chapter also has the significance of the study. So this simply means the so what of the study. So what does it mean? What does it bring to the research discourses? What does it bring to your topic? So a discussion or description here of the significance of your study. Your definition of terms, some fields or some departments have the definition of terms before they discuss their research design, or the definition of terms can be in your literature review chapter, might also suit it there. But usually we want to orientate the reader in terms of the terms that we are using and what do they mean. So you can find what is the way of doing it in your department or in your field or from your supervisor, but usually the definition of terms is somewhere in your chapter 1. Now, the next aspect is very important, and that's the assumptions and delimitations. It's not the limitations of the study. Your limitations comes in the last chapter, when you have done your dissertation is complete, your data collection, your findings, your discussions are complete, and you can then only, identify your limitations. You can't identify limitations in the first chapter. So the delimitations refers to what is the scope and what is the boundaries of your study. So for instance, delimitations might be that it's in a specific context, that you are using a specific design. It might be bounded by time, and at a specific time between this and that year. It might be delimited in terms of data points or types of data. So that's what we mean when we talk about delimitations. All right. Your assumptions, usually that goes along with your research paradigm. You can discuss the paradigm in chapter 3, your methodological chapter, or you could possibly already speak to your research paradigm in this chapter as well. And depending on your paradigm that you are working with, you will find your assumptions that emanates from your paradigm. And then, as any chapter, you will end with a summary of the chapter. I usually say that chapters have a summary, not a conclusion, except for your literature review has a conclusion and your last chapter has a conclusion. So there's a difference between a summary and a conclusion. So chapter 1 then has a short summary of the chapter, and you can then tell the reader briefly what they can expect in the following chapter. Now, in your literature review, your literature review assesses what is the current state of discourses, or what does current research say about your topic. So as any chapter, this chapter will have an introduction. It will have an objective. So what is the objective of your literature review? And then it would have a search description. I see somehow I've lost one slide somewhere where I actually gave an example of a search description, but you need to tell the reader, how did you go about searching for the literature that you're referring to? I'm sorry, but it's either been an explosion or a very huge thunder up there. Sorry if you heard that crack. So your search description is how did you go about, or for the first instance, what search engines did you use? Where did you go and search for articles? Now, a search engine might be usually scholarly search engines. It can be academic, Premier, it can be JSTOR, it can be a number of, so your research engines you'll find when you go on the library site and you check for search engines, there will be a number of search engines. There's literally hundreds of them. And if you're not quite sure how to embark on the search engines, please contact your librarian. Now, search engine, Google is also a search engine. So it's often helpful to start from Google to get a brief idea. But Google definitely isn't isn't necessarily a scholarly search engine. Google Scholar, though, can be a scholarly search engine. ResearchGate is not a research engine. ResearchGate is a repository where people showcase their work. And yes, you can get articles there, but it doesn't qualify as a search engine. You also, in your description of your search, tell the reader which key terms did you put into the search. So your key terms are often the terms that you might have in your title. So for instance, I'm currently doing a study that looks at how can we support postgraduate students. And so, for instance, I will put in doctoral students plus support, or master students plus support. And then I might from there on have other terms. So you need to explicitly tell the reader which terms you used, also how you set the limits to the search. Is it limited to the last 5 years, last 3 years? Usually we don't want to go past the previous 5 years. After that, information becomes dated, and in some fields it's dated much sooner than that. But so usually we set the parameters for the last 5 years. Then also in terms of your search description, you tell the reader, did you only search for English articles, or did you search for Spanish or Portuguese? Usually in our context, we only use the English language, but please declare that in your search description as well. The next aspect so once you've done your search, you would then report on your findings. Now, you might, I'll talk about the conceptual or theoretical framework now. So once you have identified your articles and you have read them, you've analyzed them, you have a few different options as to how are you going to organize the article or the chapter. So you might organize it according to the themes that you found coming across in your literature review. You might report it in terms of a chronological order. So there's many different options in terms of how your literature review chapter will look like. And you can decide with your supervisor what form that might take. Now, it's also possible by the end of your literature review that you might come up with a conceptual framework of your literature. So the conceptual framework is usually then a visual of what your literature review looked like, and that can also be called a theoretical framework. So you could place this framework in the beginning before your discussion of your literature review, or you can discuss the literature review and then conclude with a conceptual or theoretical framework. And that framework will then usually guide, it can then guide if you are doing quantitative research, it could guide your development of your instrument. Qualitative research, it's usually just to delineate the scope of what are the discourses, what has been done previously, but then very importantly is what is the gap. Now, in this chapter, you'll have a conclusion, because after all of this review, this is actually a mini study in its own. Once you have reached the end of all of this work, you will reach a conclusion. And very important in that conclusion, it's more than just a summary. It can contain a summary, but in your conclusion, you need to tell the reader what is the gap that you found in literature, and how are you going to attempt to fill that gap in terms of your research as it goes forward. So this chapter is very important as it places your study within the landscape of what has already been done. And then it is also a type of an argument that you provide. You make a statement, you provide the evidence in order to reach a conclusion. So this is not just a chapter with some haphazard headings, and I often find that literature reviews can be very disorganized in terms of how it's presented. And then I usually infer that the person who wrote it, maybe their mind is also disorganized, because you need to have clarity for yourself in terms of how you visualize this chapter and your findings. So often it might be useful to do a mind map and make sure that the topics or your headings follow in a logical way, that they make sense, that they progress your argument. And I find it's easier to move things around on a mind map than what it is to move writing to different spaces in a chapter. So this is very, very important for your literature review chapter, that it's well thought out, that it's well organized and well presented in a logical format. And it is actually one big argument that you are making for the place of your research and how it would contribute to the work that's already been done in terms of way forward. Now, having said that, in a master's dissertation, please remember that you don't need on a master's level to contribute to the new knowledge. All right, remember in the beginning I said that in a master's dissertation, you need to demonstrate that you can follow the research process. It is not about making a new or a unique contribution. That is the work of a PhD. So I often find that students are very overeager and they want to make huge strides and huge, have very grand aspirations and objectives. Please remember that you have about, well, full-time 2 to 3 years, which very few of our students have, but your time limit is around 3, maximum 4 years to complete this. So be very careful what you promise and in terms of what you can deliver in that time span. So it just always keep the scope in check and make sure that you don't overpromise in terms of what you are able to deliver in the end. Okay, so if you want to, there are a number of very specific types of literature reviews. So you could potentially have a scoping review, and that is a specific way of doing a literature review. Now, scoping review could be very nice because you can publish that virtually immediately. And so keep in mind that for a master's study, you need to write one article and have it submitted to a journal. So this could already be, your article submitted even before you have your findings. If you do a specific type of review, but on a master's level, I wouldn't go for systematic reviews or integrated reviews. It's too complex for the time you have. So scoping review, usually you could do within about 6 months or so. But otherwise, on a master's level, it's quite okay. Just have a straightforward literature review. So now we come to our chapter 3. And your chapter 3, as I always say, starts with the introduction to the chapter. And in this chapter, it's mainly going to be about your methodology. So you might name this chapter your research methodology, or otherwise you can say it's your research design and methods. Now, but then decide which are you going to use and use it consistently throughout your study. So the methodology means it's the design and methods. Or you can just say your research design and methods, whichever you prefer. So you would introduce the chapter again to the reader. Now you're going to build onto the brief summaries that you gave in chapter 1 around your research design. So in this chapter, you're going to go into depth in terms of what is your design. Why did you choose this design amongst other designs? So you motivate for your choice of the design. You could potentially discuss what are what's the advantages of this design? Are there potentially any disadvantages or limitations to this design, and how will you overcome these limitations? So in-depth description of your design. You might want to introduce your research questions or hypotheses in this chapter, but you will usually have this again in chapter 1. If you just want to orientate your reader, you can maybe, or even your aims or objectives. Now, within this chapter, you would clearly need to discuss what is your population, what is your sample, and what is your sampling. Then you would discuss your instrumentation. If it's a quantitative study, how did you develop your instrument? Or in a qualitative study, how was your interview guide designed, and what does it consist of? Then you would tell the examiner exactly how you went about your data collection. Now, you would start by referring to theory in terms of what data collection methods potentially was available to you, which one you chose, and then motivate why you chose that specific data collection technique. Also, its advantages, disadvantages, and how you went about actually the practical application of collecting the data. So yeah, you might say it's a qualitative study, and I am using face-to-face interviews, and you justify those. You say what's the advantages, disadvantages, and now you will unpack step by step what happened in your data collection phase. So for instance, how did you, what was your sampling list? Where did you get the list of names, for instance, or how did you contact potential participants? You will tell the reader how you went about either distributing your survey, or how did you go about your interviews, what happened during data collection, were there any challenges, did you pilot your survey or your interviews, did you need to change anything? Who collected the data? Was it yourself? Did you use field workers? When was the data collected? So really the practical implications around this. Then from there, you'll be discussing your data analysis. So first of all, identify again, what type of data analysis did you use? Why did you choose that data analysis method? So very important, especially in this chapter, that you need to justify every decision that you made. So why did you design this, select this type of a design? Why did you select this way of collecting data? Why did you select this data analysis method? And the same with your data collection. When you now discuss your data analysis, you will give what did you choose, what's the advantages, disadvantages, and then the theory around that. But then you also then discuss the actual how. How did you go about doing the analysis? In a qualitative study, what were the steps that you took? For instance, did you were there more than one person analyzing the data, or did you do it alone? So in this chapter, you've always got a theoretical background to justify your choices, but then very important, the actual practical application. So a tip that I can give you is that examiners don't want to reread a textbook. They know the textbooks. They want to know, at the minimum, do you know the theory around that? But much more interested is in how you implemented it. So this chapter especially, it's not just a lot of theory. and rewriting your textbooks. It is about the actual practical implications, how you went about it. You can always come back to this chapter after you've collected your data and tweak. There might have been things in the field that you needed to change, or you might now be able to report on your sample, exactly how large it was. You might, in your data collection, go back and then insert how many interviews, for instance, you did, and so forth. So you would then also, if you haven't discussed your rigor or your trustworthiness in chapter 1, you will then discuss it in this chapter in length. So again, not just the theory, but the practical application. I'm thinking, for instance, in a qualitative study, when we look at credibility, the examiner doesn't only want to hear that credibility means A, B, and C. And if you, for instance, say, I had prolonged engagement with my participants, that is what is in the textbook. The examiner wants to know how long did you engage with your participants. So what does it mean? Prolonged engagement. How long was your engagement? Be very specific. What did you do to continue the engagement, to improve the credibility and ultimately the trustworthiness? So this is a chapter that has theory in it, but a lot of practical application. So it might be easier if you think about the actual steps that you need to do. I need to do, this is step 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you write it up according to those steps, so that it also has a logical coherence as it goes along. If you didn't discuss your ethical issue or your ethical parameters or your ethical conditions in chapter 1, you can also then discuss it in this chapter, and then it would probably go either with your data collection, or you can have a specific heading in terms of ethical considerations. And then again, this chapter will have a summary. So in this chapter, your previous chapters were quite theory heavy. In this chapter, it's about the equal balance of theory and actual practical implications of the how of your study. Okay, so your next chapter would then discuss your results or your findings if you're doing a qualitative study. As every chapter, you have your introduction, and this chapter can have a summary or a conclusion. And in this chapter, you will then report on your results or your findings. You can think about the structure of this chapter. You can organize it according to your questions or your hypotheses or the themes in a qualitative study that you've identified. And then at the end of the chapter, it is possible to reach a conclusion, or you might just want to summarize your findings or results, and then use the conclusion in the last chapter based on your findings. As I said previously, you might have your discussion integrated within your questions or your themes. So it might be that you integrate both in this chapter, where you present the results or findings, and then you compare and contrast that findings immediately with previous research, and then you have an integrated report. Or it's possible, if this chapter is often quite heavy, that you have a discussion chapter that stands on its own. So in your discussion chapter, very much the same format: introduction, And in your discussion, you will follow the same outline as you did with your findings. So if you have an integrated report, then you'll have your theme, your findings, your direct quotes, and then compare and contrast with literature. Now, if you have the discussion alone, you will follow the same format that you had in the findings section, and then have your discussions related to the individual either questions, hypotheses, or themes as you had it in your findings chapter or your results chapter. And obviously this also then ends with a summary. Now, your final chapter then is your chapter that summarizes and has a summary, conclusions, recommendations, or outcomes. So this chapter now links very strongly with your chapter 1, as I said earlier on. So your chapter 1 and your last chapter needs to speak to each other. So in this chapter, you will tell the reader, you can give them a summary of your findings. Then you can have your conclusions based on your questions, hypotheses, or themes. In this chapter, as I said earlier, this chapter is ideally, after you've discussed your conclusions, you will be able to discuss your limitations. So now you can reflect back on your research process and think about what was the limitation of the study. For instance, you wanted to interview 30 people, but your data was saturated by interview 20, and and you can justify why it's not a limitation. For instance, limitation might be any challenges that you ran into. So it's not. I always say that I really look forward to the limitations. If you have no limitations, then I must say I don't quite believe you. So what we don't want a whitewashed account of what you did. You must remember you are still a learner, you are a student, and we expect that there would have been challenges. So don't hide these. It's important for the rigor of your study as well, so that the person reading your study can maybe take the limitations into consideration if they want to do a similar study. So think clearly about your limitations. There can be limitations around your design, your data collection, data analysis, time frames, context-specific limitations. I mean, a lot of research that was going on during COVID that caused a lot of delays and limitations and other challenges. So context and contextual issues might also have produced some limitations. Now, you would have your recommendations as well. Now, your recommendations could be for future research, but your recommendations could also go wider. You could have theoretical recommendations, you could have practice recommendations, you could have educational recommendations other than just suggestions for future research. So this can be quite a nice section for you to elaborate in terms of maybe giving a guideline for future research as well. And then definitely at this instance, you would possibly have a summary of the chapter, but then also reach a conclusion. So a conclusion, as I said earlier, your entire dissertation is a form of an argument. Your chapter 1 is where you make your statement, and the following chapters is gathering evidence. in order for you to get to a conclusion. So if you look at your dissertation as a whole, in order to get to a conclusion, you needed to have a vision. You needed to execute the vision, come up with results to answer your research question, and then reach a conclusion. So those are more or less your chapter outlines. Please remember, as I said, it could differ. You can have more than one chapter. You could have a chapter for your literature review and a separate chapter for your conceptual frameworks, for instance, or your theories. Say, for instance, you are using a specific theory and that warrants a chapter on its own, and that it maybe can't fit in with either chapter 1 or chapter 2. It's possible to have a separate chapter. It's also possible to have more than one literature review chapter, but that's usually not the case in a master's study. One chapter suffices. If you think about the 100 pages, as I mentioned in the beginning, you can imagine if you have 5 chapters, then each chapter is about 20 pages long. Maybe if you have 6, then possibly 120 pages, but that's more or less your scope. So don't bite off more than what you can actually go through in 3 years. You will pretty quickly find that it's very tiring and you might actually want your life back. So keep the scope always keep the scope in mind. Now, I've spoken about the individual chapters, but we now need to stitch it all together. So in the visual picture, yeah, it's nearly like having a lattice work or a piece of material, and you now need to sew them together to make a complete whole. So I'm just going to talk about how do we now sew the dissertation together. So in order, other than your chapters, you would have your front matter. Now, your front matter is your title page, your declarations, your acknowledgements, your summary, and your table of contents. Now, please remember that you can only write your summary at the end of the study. So don't kill yourself to try and write a summary in the beginning. It might be situated in the beginning, but that's not necessarily where you start writing it. So you can only start the summary of your study once you've completed the study. All right, so just some tips in terms of your title page. The title page needs to have the information of the degree, the department, your topic, your student name, your student number, the supervisor, and the date. Those are the absolute necessities on a title page. You will see if you go to the UNISA library, or if you get hold of your departmental guidelines, there's a specific format for your title page. So very often it starts with a student name and student number, and then the title, and then the degree, the department, the supervisor, and the date. So it might be in different orders, but this is the essential information that will be on your title page. Then next you come to your declaration. So your declaration with UNISA, with all studies, is already pre-written. So you just need to go, I've actually put the whole thing for you on the slide, but this is where you declare that you have, it's your own work, and that all the sources that you've used and quoted have been indicated and acknowledged in your references, that you've checked your work through Turnitin, and that it falls within the accepted requirements for originality, and then you declare that you've not previously submitted this work or part of it for examination at UNISA for another qualification or at any other higher education institution. So this is quite a serious declaration. Please make sure that it is indeed true of your work. And then you physically need to sign it, okay? This is a legal document, and you actually would physically sign your declaration. The nice part of your dissertation, probably one of the nicest, is your acknowledgement section. You don't have to have it, but most students enjoy writing the acknowledgement or the dedication. There's no prescribed requirements for this. You could think about acknowledging different people, your supervisors, your family, friends, spouses, participants, or research support that you've had. But this really is, you can make it as creative or in any format that you'd actually like to acknowledge the people that helped you build this thesis or this dissertation. Very important, your table of content, and that this needs to be formatted. If you don't know how to format a table of content, there are a number of ways that you could do it. You can create a table of content in your Word document. If you'd like to know how to do it, I've given you the link, and they take you through it step by step how to create a table of content in your Word document. But there's also a number of other ways that you can have your table of content, and if you try not to do it by hand. The danger of doing it by hand is that you might change a title somewhere, and then you forget to change it in your table of content, or the page numbers differ. And if it is in a specific format that can update it automatically, it really saves you a lot of time. So please refrain, even from the time that you start writing your proposal, is to have your table of contents that it's not manually done. Then I also alluded to your summary or your abstract of your dissertation. It should be able to stand on its own. You usually, your summary abstract, UNISA has a requirement that it shouldn't be longer than 350 words. So within that, you can decide if you want to have one or two sentences on the background of the study, or you could start with your aims and objectives. What's the key question or aim that you want to achieve? You need to hint to your methodology. How did you go about investigating the topic and finding answers to your questions? Your findings, what did you discover, and your conclusions. So based on your findings, what conclusions did you draw? What answers did you find to your research questions? If you have space, you can add your contribution, or if you have space, if there is any a summarized version of your recommendations. But it's quite succinct. And the reason for the 350 words is also for indexing purposes. So you will find that when you allude the examination office that you're intending to submit your dissertation for examination, they will send you a form that tells you exactly what your front page must look like, the word limits in your abstracts, and any other formatting issues that you might find. Then your key terms, UNISA requires 10 keywords, and usually your keywords is taken from your title, At the very least, they should be there, but there could also be refinements. So if we look at the title, a diagnostic model for the prediction of mathematics achievement for university students. If you have 10 keywords, mathematic achievement, academic performance, psychometric measuring instruments, diagnostic test, first year university students, cognitive factors, intelligence, aptitude, previous performance, study methods, attitudes, interests, anxiety, personality, and adjustment. Quite a list of key terms, but the requirement from UNISA is that you have 10 keywords. Also very important for indexing purposes and retrieval, so choose your keywords carefully. All right. Now we get to, so after all of that front matter, you have your chapters, and then after your chapters, we get to our back matter. Now your back matter refers to your reference section and any annexures that you add. Now your annexures are usually documents for your audit trail, and these could include ethical clearance letters, non-disclosure agreements, interview guides or instruments, transcribed interviews, or an example of one transcribed interview if it's a qualitative study, the editor's letter that your work has been edited. Your originality report can come as an annexure as well, or some departments put it at the very beginning of your study, but I usually prefer to have them as back matter because it is the back matter is the annexures are part of your audit trail to show the examiner that you have evidence of your ethical clearance, your agreements that you said you'll have, the interview guide instruments, so that they can also check for instance, the instrument's validity, face value, and things like that. The transcribed interview in qualitative studies, as I said earlier, the examiners don't only want to read theory, they know the theory. So they want to know what you promised in your data collection. Did you actually do it in your interview? So that they can assess that as well on their own. So often I find students would say, oh, I had the interviews lasted an hour, and then the transcribed interview is only 5 pages. And there is no ways an hour interview will give you about 25 transcribed pages. And so it's very easy to not that you want to catch out someone, but that you can clearly see that what they wrote in the report and what they actually did doesn't coincide. If you are, for instance, also saying, I use the following interview techniques and just write them from a textbook, you can quite clearly now go to the interview and see if those techniques were actually used and practiced. Your reference section, please make sure that it is comprehensive and that it is perfect. There's nothing so annoying to an examiner to find missing references, sloppy referencing. They very often make the assumption that if your references is messy, then they assume that your research was equally messy. So this is one area where you do have control. Please make use of a referencing, well, there's apps as well, but a referencing system. UNISA supports a few. I've been using Mendeley because I quite like it, but they are stopping that license this year. And I think they might from now on only support RefWorks. Now you can go to the library site, you can download RefWorks. It is supported by the library and the license is prepaid. So please, there is a way to have your references in a Word document, but it's not accurate. You know, it depends on how you put it in. Where with RefWorks, you know, it gets pulled in, and it is more accurate. So please, you can then also in the RefWorks change how the citation style looks. You might have one style for your dissertation, but when you write an article, they might have a different style, and it's then very easy to change your references rather than by doing it manually. So in this day and age, you do not do your references manually. It's really, it's not on. Please use appropriate avenues to manage your references. So in terms of the technically correct, in terms of the bibliographic requirements, so effective retrieval. So different departments might have different referencing styles. So please check the guidelines, what style they commit to. UNISA supports the Harvard style, but I, for instance, know in my department that it's a revised Harvard. So it might differ within different departments. Psychology, I know, uses the APA system. So find out which referencing system your department subscribes to, and that you then can also use that in your managing of your references. Okay, what I've done, I've just given you a few evaluation criteria that you can have a look to evaluate your own dissertation and see if it meets the basic standards. The first standard would be, does my title contain the key concepts developed in the dissertation? Does the thesis chapters hang together? So they hang together in terms of the order that you're presenting it, but very important, it also has an internal logic. The chapter itself needs to hang together. That meaning that there is a logic to the presentation of the information, there's a logic to the argumentation, and there's a logic to presenting the information. Just a note on that, I very often find that students will have a heading. Say, for instance, they'll have a heading research design, but under that heading, they discuss the data collection. Now, immediately you can see that there is an incongruence and that there's an internal logic problem. So please make sure when you have a heading that you actually discuss under the heading the information relevant to the heading. And it might seem so obvious, but I cannot tell you how many times I read theses and dissertations and proposals where the information under the heading doesn't speak to the heading. Then does my introduction guide the reader about the research structure and or scope? Is there a sense of an argument developing in my dissertation? Do I guide my reader by making links between different sections and subsections? So this is a very important writing criteria. I always say that academic writing is no one's first language. Please, it's something that you develop, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. So logical writing and having transition sections and having paragraphs of different lengths, sentences of different lengths. Please look at your writing abilities and that you can write and present your dissertation in a way that doesn't make it difficult to read. All right, so if there are writing workshops or that you require assistance with your writing, please, you can have the most amazing results. But if you can't write them up effectively, then you can't communicate your research. So writing is very, very important. And we, as I said, we are seldom developed in academic writing before we get to our dissertations. So if you need writing help, please find help. You can go to the UNISA library as well. There are sources, there's resources, or find a developmental editor that will help you with your writing, and you can then learn as you go. But the big secret is that you actually need to write to improve your writing. So there are some lovely textbooks, and I think I've got an example of a few that you can use. But very, very importantly is your ability to write and report. And then I think I've mentioned this one, do the headings and the subheadings encapsulate the meaning of the text that follows the heading and vice versa. So that's the that I've spoken to. So it links with the internal logic of your dissertation, and the chapters is your external logic. All right, so that's more or less the presentation. The following few slides is just some hints to books that you might find helpful. This is quite an old book by Henning Gravett and van Rensburg, but it's really very user-friendly. It's not expensive. You can get it from Skykes, or you can get it from Take-A-Lot. Or it's quite easy to get, but it's very, very user-friendly. It's very practical, and you can literally, develop yourself and your writing through following the examples and hints in this book. The other one is what I really find very helpful is Lateghan's book on Get Ready, Get Set, Go. It's preparing for doctoral studies, but it also speaks to chapters and chapter development. So it's useful for your master's studies as well. And if you are going on with your PhD, then you already have a nice reference book. So when you are reading for your dissertation, you read on a number of levels. You read on your topic, you read on your methodology, and you also then read for your development. And the two books that I've shown you now are reading for your development in terms of academic prose, how to think, how to argue, and how to write. So please take care of all of those levels. And then finally, please enjoy the journey. It's not just the destination. It can be hellish to wait for 5 years before you celebrate your successes. So please, when you have come to certain points, for instance, your proposal has been accepted, then celebrate it. If you've got ethical clearance, celebrate it. When you've got your permissions to go and collect data, celebrate it. So make it a journey that you enjoy, and you celebrate each milestone. Okay, so from my side, that's the end of the slides. I just want to go back and just go to the Q&A section. So just give me a minute so that I can just wait for it to load. Okay, it's busy loading, so just give it a minute or two. Okay, there's one question. Bulti, thank you for the nice presentation. Next, I want to ask how to get the copies. You can definitely go and have a look at the library. They might have copies. But these books are very inexpensive, and you'll use them for the rest of your academic journey. So I often say, it's quite difficult with the library. The books are often out, or you need to give them back. So invest in a few maybe books that's your own. As you can afford them. So maybe I always suggest the students buy at least one updated book in terms of research designs, methodologies, and such. And maybe one or two of these developmental books, and the rest you can work on articles that you can download from the library for free. So it's not a massive investment, but at least try. All right. Okay, so Danae just added to please click to access the previous recording and PowerPoint presentations on OneDrive. So there's the link for you for the previous recordings, and I'm sure that these recordings will be available soon, or tonight's recording will be available soon as well. Okay, so we have quite a few minutes, so please, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we can have a discussion around your questions. So it's not in the questions, not in the chats, but in the question and answer section. Silence in the room. Either I was quite explicit or I've answered all your preempted questions. Thank you so much, Fazal, for the thank you. I really hope that it demystifies the process in terms of, we often pick up a dissertation and then we think that's how it happened, but the messiness between getting to that final dissertation is often not seen. So I hope that at least the process is a bit clearer, and in terms of the expectation per chapter, that it's also a bit clearer for you. Okay, Biomedi, how about having a theoretical framework as an independent chapter for your literature review? Yes, I did mention that. Biomedi, it is indeed possible. Remember, I said you can have one or two chapters. Sometimes it can fit into one, but sometimes it's too much for one chapter, and then rather split it. Any other questions forthcoming? Might also be that you're exhausted. Middle of the week. I'm going to give it another minute or two, and then for the organizers, I think we can then wrap up tonight's session if there aren't any other questions coming up. Going, gone. Nothing more. Don't see anything more on my side. Okay, then I am just going to bid you a farewell for the evening. Please be safe and enjoy your journey in your master's dissertation. Keep well. Bye-bye.